Thank you for joining me. I want to talk a little bit today about the topic of immigration and in particular about arguments for and against open immigration, which is a popular position these days among a number of philosophers in academia. So there are two arguments to be made in favor of open borders, and although I'm not a fan certainly of open borders, I think they are interesting arguments, and for this discussion I'm going to draw on the work of Chandran Kukathas. One argument in favor of open borders is the freedom argument, namely that people ought to be free to live where they please. That's just an inherent human right, is to be able to live where one wants to be able to live. The earth has been given to all of us in common, so goes the argument, and for some of us to want to restrict others and prevent them from being able to live where they please is to violate their inherent human rights. The second argument in favor of open borders is a humanity argument, and this is just that it is unconscionable that some people should be required to remain in circumstances that are impoverished or degraded when they could be able to move and just by virtue of moving come to a better situation. So those are the two arguments, freedom and humanity, in favor of open borders. Now, there are a variety of objections to the open borders argument, which is real popular, like I mentioned, these days among philosophers and academia. I want to focus on three objections, or three families of objections. One is economic objections, another is cultural objections, and then a third is security objections. First of all, the economic objections to open borders. So two objections are typical here. One is that having open borders will undermine the ability of the existing citizens in the recipient area to continue to prosper, and especially to continue to prosper by virtue of the economic arrangements that they have set up within their own borders and their society. Obviously, this depends upon the kinds of people who are coming in from the originating countries to the recipient countries. It obviously also depends on the nature of the economics in the recipient country, whether those economic circumstances are good or bad. Okay, a second argument against open borders on economic grounds is that it is unjust to people, citizens in the recipient area, especially in circumstances where there is coerced redistribution, for them to have to share their resources with persons originating from elsewhere. Okay, so think here of the entitlement systems like exist in the West. In the United States, for instance, there are entitlement coercive redistribution systems like Medicare and Medicaid, Social Security, welfare, other similar sorts of entitlement programs, where the government takes tax money from some people and coercively gives it to others so that others can share in the prosperity of those who the government has taken money from. Now, the argument here is that although it is true that that may undermine prosperity for existing people in the recipient countries, even more so it's wrong to have open borders precisely because those open borders will bring about further unjust coercive redistributions. Now, what are we to make of these two arguments, these two economic arguments? I think they're very interesting as arguments. I would say from a personal perspective as a philosopher, I'm not sure if we have a right as persons to prosperity. It certainly seems to me that that we ought in life to expect basic accommodations and basic necessities. But beyond that, I'm not sure if we have a right to prosperity. So I'm not sure if I'm convinced by the argument that open borders, if it would lead to diminished prosperity, would be unjustifiable. I am much more convinced, though, by the argument that it would be unjust to coercively redistribute people's wealth to an even greater extent as a result of open borders. So the argument here is not one based on diminished prosperity, but rather based on the injustice of coercive redistributions, the ways in which they violate people's liberty and especially people's rights to the labor of their hands. And I think that if open borders would lead to increases in coercive redistribution through entitlement-based systems, then it's pretty hard to justify uh, loose immigration policies that allow uh, even more extensive coercive redistributions on the basis of such entitlement systems. A second family of objections to open borders comes from the cultural integrity camp. And again, drawing on the work of Chandran Kukathas on this topic, the cultural integrity camp says, look, it's really important to people's ability to flourish, that they be able to live in a culture that has a certain kind of integrity to it, that is a certain continuity, a certain stability, maybe even a certain amount of homogeneity, whether that's ethnic or otherwise. And this is important to people's well-being and flourishing because it helps constitute their sense of identity. No man is an island. It's important for us to rely upon others, and in circumstances in which that reliance upon others is undermined or disintegrated by virtue of a bunch of other people who don't share our values, come from different value systems, or don't share our cultural backgrounds or heritages, maybe don't know the history of our land, it can actually harm our own well-being in, say, recipient countries for people from elsewhere to come in and to make up, a substantial demographic from a substantial demographic to alter the statistical makeup of the recipient country in ways that don't necessarily promote or contribute to the integrity and stability of the recipient country. Kukathas thinks that although this is a legitimate objection, nevertheless it is overridden by by virtue of certain uh, imperatives. So, for instance, he places great emphasis on the plight of refugees and on the importance of providing refugees with a way out. I am convinced by that argument about refugees, but not necessarily the argument vis-a-vis other kinds of people. So, with regard to refugees, I think that definitely special provisions ought to be made in modern nation states for persons who are coming from war-torn environments or who are unable to secure the basic rudiments of human dignity and necessity in their originating lands. I think that that's definitely a special circumstance. But apart from that special circumstance, I remain unconvinced by Kukathas on other topics. Um, so, for instance, I do buy the cultural integrity argument. I think that it is important to persons' well-being that they be able to exist in a social setting where values are shared, where there is some degree of stability, where there is cultural continuity, a shared history, a shared heritage. I think that that's important to persons' well-being, and I think that persons can exclude others from their country, provided those others are not in refugee-style circumstances, provided that they have the basics of human necessities. I think that it is justifiable to exclude those others on cultural integrity grounds. So I'm unconvinced by Kukathas' arguments there in that regard. As for the security family of arguments, the third family, so we have so far economic arguments, economic arguments, cultural integrity arguments, and then the third family of arguments is the security arguments. As for those arguments, they run as follows. Open borders immigration contributes to, it undermines personal security for citizens in recipient areas. Kukathas thinks that this is something that is regrettable, but it can be managed by virtue of appropriate policing action and appropriate security personnel to ensure that the bad elements are weeded out in successful ways and the good elements are permitted to enter appropriately in open borders arrangements. I find the security argument a little bit less persuasive than the cultural integrity and economics arguments that I've mentioned, although I do acknowledge that security does become more of an issue in open border circumstances. Still, modern nation states are sufficiently porous these days that I think basically anybody who is clever enough and able enough with appropriate economic backing can get into countries and do dastardly things without the awareness of the people or the citizens, the security personnel in the recipient countries. I think that that's sufficiently easy to do that I'm unconvinced that the security threat would be increased by virtue of loosened immigration policies in America or elsewhere, or even open borders policies. I think that the security threat would remain largely unchanged because I think the security threat is already pretty substantial, and that it wouldn't get any worse by virtue of open borders. At any rate, the most convincing objections to open borders, again, at the end of the day, I'm unconvinced by Koukouthis on the open borders topic. I think that there ought to be immigration limits, and substantial immigration limits at that. And the most convincing arguments in favor of substantial immigration limits for me personally are the economics and cultural integrity arguments. I think that it is harmful to liberty. It violates human freedom to coercively redistribute in circumstances in which people were not born into a society and have come here from elsewhere. I think that taking the recipients' hard worked for goods and coercively redistributing them to others who were not originally a part of the recipient area is potentially a violation of liberty, and that it ought to be minimized. I'm not saying that that itself is prohibitive, but I think that it ought to be minimized. Such coercive redistributions ought to be minimized. Perhaps the objection there is more against coercive entitlement-based redistributions than it is against immigration itself. But if we live in societies these days that have coercive entitlement-based redistributions, then it is something that must be considered when we think about the immigration topic. For the cultural integrity objection, I am convinced by that objection as well, and I'm unconvinced by Koukouthis' response to it. I am convinced at the end of the day by the notion that people, in order to flourish, need to have some degree of values, integrity, some degree of historical continuity and stability in their surroundings and among the people who they live alongside. I think otherwise it's really hard for us to experience personal flourishing because we face degrees of personal isolation when no one else shares our values, or degrees of personal isolation when there's no awareness of history, or no common stability in the peoples and shared memories around us. And I think that undermines our ability to experience personal flourishing. I think that people in recipient countries do have a right to personal flourishing to the extent that they can achieve such flourishing in this life. And I think that to the extent that it undermines their ability to achieve that flourishing, open borders immigration is unjustifiable and ultimately will lead to harmful results for most parties involved. Again, the exception to this is, of course, the refugee situation. I think if the basics of life cannot be secured, then persons ought to be able to go elsewhere. At the end of the day, I suppose I am convinced by the analogy of marriage. Yes, you ought to be able to marry, but that doesn't mean that you can marry any particular individual. You can only marry somebody who is willing themselves to marry you. And I think that immigration is similar. I think that people ought to be able to immigrate, to leave their original country if they so please, but that doesn't mean that the recipient land needs to marry them. It doesn't mean that it is obligatory upon any particular receiving country to have to marry them in response. Yes, people ought to be able to marry. Yes, they ought to be able to immigrate, but that doesn't mean that there is a right to marry any particular person or the right to immigrate to any particular land. Just the right to immigrate to whatever land will have you or whatever land will receive you, just like we have a right to marry whatever person will have us. I think that that's the best way of conceiving of the immigration topic, and it's a balanced perspective between the open borders view and the closed borders view, which I think is too far in the other direction at the same time.